Okay, so today what we're doing is we're covering the chapters on integrated marketing communication. And we will also cover the first chapter, subchapter in IMC, Integrated Marketing Communication, which is on advertising and public relations. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is the importance of integrated marketing communications. So integrated marketing communications really is a combination of all of the communications that a brand has with the public. And obviously that communication process is critically important because even if you have all of your other ducks in the row, you have a great product, you offer it at a great price, your channels are incredibly efficient. If you fail in that last C or last P, depending on which framework you're looking at, if you fail in that communication, then your customers will not buy. Either they don't know about your brand, they don't understand your brand and what its value proposition is, or they don't know where to get it. Okay, so that communication is really important. We'll talk later about IMC and more specifically how IMC differs from earlier ways of thinking about the promotional P, which was less integrated than it was before. But we've always talked about the promotional mix, all right? And so there are 5 elements of the promotional mix. Advertising. We all know what advertising is, right? Sales promotion. Sales promotion generally consists of coupons, discounts, rebates, those kinds of things. Public relations, which is somewhat similar to advertising, except that it's unpaid. And consumers tend to view it as more objective because it's not directly sponsored by the brand. In reality, public relations is no more objective than advertising is. Okay. You also have personal selling or sales, which involves either in-house salespeople, for instance, people who are sitting in a call center where people call and place orders, or outside salespeople. Commonly when we talk about sales, most of what we're talking about are those outside salespeople who are out there getting the orders. And when we move on to the sales chapter after this, next week, we'll see that, that's really the bulk of what we talk about when we talk about sales. And then the last of the 5 is direct and digital. It used to be that direct was its own thing, and digital kind of got mushed into advertising. But as the digital landscape has changed over time, we have tended to push digital more into the direct because it does tend to be more personal and more one-on-one, which means that it shares characteristics with direct marketing. Okay? So those are the elements of the promotional mix. If we take a look at these individually, we talk about advertising consisting of things like broadcast, which is traditional TV programming, ABC, NBC, CBS. those are kind of what we talk about in terms of broadcast. We also break up those channels from TV programming like cable. Okay, I'm not sure why. I think it's historical that at one point there was only broadcast TV. There were 4 channels: NBC, CBS, ABC, and PBS, and that's it. And then all these cable channels started. And it's more than just a semantic difference, because one of the things you find is that broadcast TV tends to appeal to a much wider audience, whereas cable tends to have more of a segmented market. So the people who watch Home and Garden Channel, for instance, are very different than the people who watch ESPN in general terms. Okay? So there's a historic reason for doing it, but there's also a practical reason for separating them out. So we have the 2 versions of TV. We have print, which includes radio, or includes magazines and newspapers. Newspapers have morphed and are becoming more digital, and that's one of the trends that we'll talk about later on. We have online advertising in the form of what are called banner advertisements. We talked about this when we talked about the e-commerce chapter. So there is still a piece of digital that does belong in advertising. Okay. Mobile, which is becoming increasingly prevalent, and outdoor advertising, which in many places is almost disappearing because city ordinances and regulations are making it very difficult for companies to put up billboards and things like that. So many of us think that's a good thing. From a marketing and promotion standpoint, the effectiveness of outdoor was always among the lowest, if not the lowest, in terms of returns. So losing outdoor, except for the people who owned those billboards and rented them out to companies for their advertisement, except for that, the banning of outdoor advertising has not really come at much of an expense for organizations. Okay? So the next one that we have is sales promotion. And if you'll give me just 1 second, I want to stop and make sure everything is going okay with the recording. Okay, so then we're going to move on to sales promotions. Sales promotions consist of, discounts, coupons, like we've already talked about. They also consist of displays. So like if the grocery store has a big Easter display with a cutout bunny or something like that, that's considered to be sales promotion as well. And also demonstrations. So everything from the free samples that they give out in the grocery store to handing out product on the street, so like at a festival or something like that. We commonly call this guerrilla marketing, where you have people out and about trying to promote the product. So most, if not all, of guerrilla marketing also fits into that sales promotion. Personal selling, which is a personal one-on-one interaction, at least commonly one-on-one interaction, where you have an individual employee who is working to try to not only build sales for the organization, but also build relationships with customers. Okay. And finally, or not finally because we still have one, public relations, again, is an unpaid form of advertising, and we'll talk more about that later today, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that right now. Digital and direct, we also talked about. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that are changing in the world of integrated marketing communications. Just the integration itself is a new thing that is happening. The increase of digital as a major component of the IMC mix. Companies used to spend, most of their budget, if not all of their budget, on what we call traditional advertising or traditional promotions, which is advertising, public relations, sales promotion. One of the things that you're finding now is that there's a big transition. Most companies, I think the last figure I saw was 80+% of companies are doing something within what we call new media, which is digital. And they're shifting larger budgets to digital. So whereas just a few years ago, the budget for an organization for digital might be in the single digits, now the budget for digital in kind of the leading edge companies who are involved in digital marketing is somewhere on the order of 30% of their advertising budget. So that's a huge shift, and that shift is expected to accelerate. There are a couple reasons behind that. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about e-commerce. But that's a trend that I think is here to stay, and we're going to see an escalation of the amount of money that's put into digital. One of the opportunities that digital provides is another trend, and that is the use of customer-generated content. So in the past, virtually every form of promotion, every bit of promotion that an organization did was prepared by the organization. They controlled the messaging, and this is a really critical part of consumer-generated content. Is not all consumer-generated content is favorable. The brand no longer controls the message because social media has given voice to consumers that they can now drown out. And all you have to do is look at what happened to United this week to see how loud that voice can be and drown out everything else that the brand has to say. They pretty much hijacked that incident. The consumer judged United, and you're seeing protests, for instance, Chinese cutting up their frequent flyer miles cards for United because this was a Chinese doctor who was removed from the aircraft. So they have responded much as you might expect because Chinese are a very communal as opposed to an individualistic culture like the United States. And so their response is going to be much more uniform in support of someone that they accept as an us versus a them. Okay. You see more segmented markets. Even on TV, you have opportunities to reach a more targeted audience by choosing the appropriate media. But we also have, through digital, we have the possibility of what's called one-on-one marketing, where a message can be customized to an individual. So, for instance, if you went to Amazon last night and looked at something, when you log on to Amazon again today, you're going to be presented with those items you looked at, and potentially they'll send you an email and say, hey, you looked at this, you forgot to order it. So that's an example of one-on-one marketing. Nobody else gets that message. That message is crafted specifically to you. We see that the TV viewing habits have shifted dramatically. Part of it due to more options, but also most of the change that we see in TV viewing habits is that the synchronous TV viewing, in other words, sitting there at 8 o'clock when The Big Bang Theory comes on Thursday nights to watch The Big Bang Theory, has virtually disappeared in many households. Instead, consumers are using a number of options to cherry pick the programs that they want to watch, and they're not held to the schedule that is promoted by the station. So they can record the program and watch it later. They can watch it on these new custom online channels, so they can go to CBS Online, and if they have a subscription, they can view whole seasons of Big Bang Theory if they want, rather than watching one episode at a time. They can go on YouTube and watch something that's an alternative to what's produced by the traditional broadcast and other TV stations. And this, in your generation and younger, is becoming much more prevalent than traditional TV watching. To go to YouTube and watch crazy cat videos, or that Pizza Rat, which had millions of views. I'm not quite sure what was so appealing about a rat carrying a piece of pizza that people felt the need to watch it, but they do. My grandson sits there, and there's a trucks channel on YouTube where some guy goes out and videos different trucks and construction equipment, and that's all it is. He videotapes it working and uploads it to YouTube, and it gets millions of views. Crazy people, like to watch trucks. Okay. So the decline of print, of course, most print has moved to digital, although there are still pockets of people, mainly older consumers, who still really like to read a traditional newspaper. I was never so happy as when newspapers went online and I didn't have to get newsprint on my hands anymore. There's a shift away from what we call interruption marketing, which means you're watching a program and they interrupt you with a commercial. Or you're reading a magazine article and then there's a big ad there and it interrupts your reading and you have to scroll past it or turn the page past it. Call that interruption marketing. What we're seeing is a shift towards what we call native advertising, where the advertising just kind of seamlessly fits in. So an example of that is the news feed on Facebook, where sponsored posts appear in your news feed just like every other post does, as opposed to interrupting you. We also are seeing more product placement as a form of advertising versus commercials. All right? And then the final trend that we're seeing is that content marketing is really on the rise. You could talk about commercials as being content, and certainly they were, but they were a relatively anemic form of content. What you're seeing now is much more rich content, where the aim is to provide value to customers as opposed to being strictly promotional. So for instance, IKEA might put up a video about how to assemble a particular piece of furniture or how to accessorize or personalize a piece of furniture. Those are examples of content marketing that we really never saw in the past. Okay, so the question then is why we have integrated marketing communication as opposed to talking about this as just the fourth P of promotion. Okay. In order to understand why integrated marketing communication is important, it's first important to understand what integrated marketing communication is. And it really is creating a consistent brand image across touch points. So regardless of whether the consumer sees your ad on TV, hears about it on a website, walks into the store even and sees messaging displayed in the store, regardless of which touch point the consumer is exposed to, they get exactly the same message. Okay, this is critically important because without a consistent message, it's very difficult to maintain a consistent brand image. Now, there are exceptions to this. One of those exceptions is Geico. If you look at the Geico commercials, you see that at any given time, they have 4 or 5, maybe more, different messages running. So they have the Geico Gecko running. They have, sometimes in the past they've had the Caveman, and so you still kind of see those around occasionally. And then there are several other Geico messages. Technically, that's not good. The reason that Geico can survive despite having ignored one of the cardinal rules of integrated marketing communication is that they spend an incredible amount of money on advertising. That allows them to create multiple somewhat related messages. The idea, I'm sure, being that each message has a slightly different target audience. And that they're hoping that at least one of those message implementations will resonate with every consumer. The only way that that is feasible is by spending a gigantic amount of money to try to maintain multiple different messages at the same time. Plus, the messages are somewhat related, even though the execution is widely different. Okay. The idea is that with integrated marketing communication, not only do you present a consistent brand to your target audience, which allows them to develop a relatively concrete image of what your brand is and what it stands for, but the messages reinforce each other. Later, we're going to talk about message frequency, which is the number of times that the average consumer is exposed to a particular message. If the messages are not closely integrated, you lose reach. Again, that's why Geico is effective, is that they're still achieving reach by spending a ginormous amount of money on advertising. Okay. Sometimes this is very challenging to generate an integrated marketing campaign. Part of the problem is that the structure of who handles different types of marketing communication often means that different people are in charge of different types of messages. For instance, I worked for Gray Advertising a couple of summers ago for the summer as a faculty intern. And Gray is very typical of advertising agencies in that they're very siloed. So for instance, you have your digital team, which is fundamentally very young, very tech savvy. Then you have your creative people who are also siloed. So your print people are in one place, your video people are in another place, and then you have public relations that's totally separate from all of them. Gray has 36 floors of an entire half block on Madison Avenue, or near Madison Avenue. And communication within the building is very poor. The notion is that when you have this distributed responsibilities like that, that the account executive, who to all intents and purposes represents the client at the ad agency, that account executive is able to coordinate everybody and manage the different silos so that there's a consistent message. Now, the problem is that in most advertising agencies, the account executive is compensated based on bringing in new business, not managing existing business. So while it's technically their responsibility to bring all of the folks to the table so that everything is coordinated, they're primarily out selling new business. Okay? Now, one of the things that I will add for you guys, because I can't display this here, is I have a link to an ad that was done. I even forget who the client is now. But it was a series of ads leading up to the Super Bowl. And they had 3 different implementations. One was the Showgirls, one was Cowboys, and one was kind of Badlands kind of characters. And in this case, the 3 implementations worked really well because there was a coordinating theme behind all 3. And they also did gamification, which is a way of trying to make advertising a contest. Like the Lay's thing, where you try and pick what's going to be the next flavor, and they have a contest. And people suggest various flavors of for Lay's potato chips. In this case, the idea was that during the Super Bowl, they would show all 3 implementations, and then people were to vote for what they thought was the best implementation, I think on the company's Facebook page or something like that. So in this case, those 3 implementations did reinforce each other. So I'll put that link up for you on Blackboard so you can take a look at that. By the way, if you guys have questions, you can just stop me. You know, I'm recording this, but this is not to be perfect. Okay, so if you have questions, just interrupt. Okay? So then let's look at what the communication process looks like. And are any of you communication students? No. Oh, good. So nobody's going to disagree with me. Because I understand that marketing books are still teaching an older version of the communication process than they learn in communication. But I don't know the one that they learn in communication. I only know the one that's in your book. So that's the one we're going to talk about. All right? So the process starts with a pen that doesn't work. All right, starts with a sender. Commonly, an advertising agency, an internal advertising arm of the organization, or increasingly their social media team. All right. But you have some sender. The sender has to encode the message. Now notice I said encode. This is not encrypting the message. As a matter of fact, it's the exact opposite. As far away from encrypting as you can possibly get. The idea of encoding is to use language that will resonate with the target audience and that will be readily interpretable by the target audience. And they do that using words and pictures, words and images. Okay? The reason being that we have not perfected the Vulcan mind meld. So I cannot get information directly from my head into your head. I have to use some form of communication in order to do that, which means that there's going to be some inefficiencies in transferring information because your experience isn't exactly like my experience. When we get into international marketing in a couple of weeks, which is our last topic of the semester, there you start to see the problems get even bigger when we talk about encoding. And those go well beyond language problems to include cultural differences. All right? So in some way, they encode the message. Then the message has to go through some kind of media. All right? Print, broadcast, social network, some kind of media in order to reach you. When it reaches the receiver, it's decoded, hopefully accurately. You know, the idea is that you hope that this doesn't turn into a version of telephone that you played when you were a little kid, where messages were whispered from one person to the next person, and by the time they got to the end of the chain, they were totally unintelligible and bore no relationship to the message that was started. So the hope is that they get decoded and then reach the receiver in a form that it is reasonably close to the message that the sender meant to send. Now, after the receiver receives the message, the hope is that they will take some form of action or have some response. In the case of advertising, we're really hoping that they'll go out and buy stuff from us. And some form of feedback. In other words, they might post some communications, for instance, about the message. Okay. Now, two problems with this process. The biggest problem that interferes in this process is noise. Okay? And we don't mean volume. When we talk about noise in advertising, we're talking about all of the things that interfere with this process. So things that we talked about earlier in the semester, like selective attention, selective recall, those are related to noise somewhat. You have other things that happen, for instance, consumers who have recorded a program who skip the commercials. Okay, all kinds of things that potentially interfere with you reaching your receiver with a message that resembles the one that you meant to send. You also have cultural lens, and when we talk about cultural lens, and we'll talk about this more later, it does not have to be something that it just occurs between international advertising. It can just as easily happen within a single country or even a single community. And all you have to do is look at the divide in this country to see that the same messages are being received differently by different subsets of the population. They're being interpreted differently. Even different groups are listening to different outlets, not even listening to the same outlets. And so, all of this is noise that interferes with the proper functioning of this process. The other problem that you have is related to this, and that's the problem of clutter. And we'll talk more about clutter, but clutter is this notion that there is just so much to pay attention to out there that it becomes difficult to transcend and reach customers. Now, a few years ago when I taught this class, when I talked about clutter, I would be talking mainly about other advertising that made it difficult for advertisers to reach customers because of so many ads and trying to remember each ad. Now, I think with digital, we really need to talk about all content as creating clutter, because there are so many different things competing for our attention every second of the day that it's very difficult for an advertisement or other kinds of promotional tactic to transcend that clutter to reach a consumer. I did something with my consumer behavior class a few years ago. We were doing a research project, and we were interested about how consumers respond to direct-to-consumer advertising. Those are those ads for prescription drugs. Okay. So one of the tasks that the students had was they were asked to interview someone, and one of the questions in this survey was, tell me about an ad for a prescription drug that you've seen recently. And it could be a print ad or it could be a TV commercial. And I would say well over 50% of the reports that I got back were jumbled in some way. Either the consumer had mixed up the drug name with a different ad. More seriously, they had mixed up the drug name with the condition it was designed to treat. So these are indicators that this process does not work particularly well. Okay? So let's look at the steps in the communication process that are designed to improve this communication process. All right? So the first step in the communication process is to identify your target audience. This should not come as a shock to anyone. Everything that we've talked about this semester has started with identifying your target audience, whether you're talking about promotions, whether you're talking about pricing, whether you're talking about channels. So it's no surprise that the promotional process starts with identifying your target market. The next thing that you do is to set objectives. Again, not surprising. This is the exact same thing that we saw as the second step in every part, every element in the 4 Ps. Okay. I want to just go over all of the steps in the process, and then we'll come back and talk about the individual steps. Next step is to design the message. Okay. Then choose the media that you will use to carry the message, and then finally select the message source and collect feedback. Increasingly, that feedback is coming in the form of metrics. All right? So let's take a moment then to talk about the steps. In terms of the communication message, there are different objectives, and commonly an organization has multiple objectives, or they should have multiple objectives in creating an ad. Okay. Some of these are what we call top of funnel, which means that they have to do with attitudes about the brand, awareness, liking, okay, positive attitudes about the brand. Some of the objectives probably have to do with what we call bottom of the funnel actions. Things like preference, in other words, I prefer this product to competitors. Okay. Conviction, and then finally purchase. It's sometimes hard to parse these actions out, or these steps in the communication process. For instance, when does liking become conviction? When does conviction become purchase? Very, very squishy stuff indeed. There's an alternative to this, and the alternative is something called, and I purposefully mispronounce this because it makes it easier to remember. Okay. AIDA. It's really called AIDA, but I like to pronounce it so that each letter in the acronym is more consciously observed or heard. So this is an acronym for attention, interest, desire, and action. So get attention. Hold interest. Arouse desire. And then obtain action. All right. Many researchers prefer this model, as well as many businesses prefer this model, partly because it's easier to parse out whether or not you've achieved your objectives. So if you've achieved awareness, consumers know about your product. If you've achieved interest, then they're interested in learning more about your product. Okay. If you have generated desire, then they want to buy your product, and action, they have bought your product. Okay. So a less squishy way of looking at things. So commonly, an organization and their advertising agency would get together and come up with goals. Based on where they are right now, they would set goals and objectives for one or more of these elements. Often, especially in digital, bless you, especially in digital, where we have better metrics, we will set all 4 objectives for all 4 elements. In advertising agencies, they tend to focus on awareness because that is one of the few things that they can assess. And they assessed it with focus groups and things like that. We'll talk about how these are tracked later on. All right. All right. So then the next step in the process is to design the message. And this is most of what we usually think of as advertising. You have to design the content. So you've probably seen Mad Men or something like that, where they talk about advertising and they talk about, things like the big idea of the message, often the tagline. What has to be determined is the theme or the appeal that you're going to use in developing the message. So we talk about both the message structure, which is how things are said, as well as the content of what is said. And so your book talks about 3 of these kinds of appeals. They talk about a rational appeal, an emotional appeal, and a moral appeal. A rational appeal is appealing to your self-interest. Okay. This is the smart thing to do, ergo, you should do it. All right. An emotional appeal goes back to ELM that we talked about in the first section of the class, where we talk about the feel then do part of ELM. So emotional appeals then work for products that will most effectively engage that emotional or affective decision-making model. Moral appeal is an appeal to what is right or what should be. In addition to this, there are several other appeals that I think are important for you to understand. One of these is a humor appeal. Okay. Another is fear. And a fear appeal can be the most effective form because when you engage fear, you're most likely to get a response. Sex appeal. There's this notion that sex sells everything, and it's not exactly true. It can attract more interest, but sex does not sell everything. And then there's a bandwagon. And we'll talk more about bandwagon next time when we talk about digital, because that's a very powerful form of promotions when we talk about digital. So in terms of the structure of how you say things, that those are what you say. In terms of structure and how you say things, it's important to understand whether or not you're going to draw conclusions. So here's the story, and here's the moral of the story or the conclusion of the story. So you should do X. Okay. The alternative is that you don't draw a conclusion. So for instance, there were a series of commercials that were done for one of the margarine companies. I think it was I Can't Believe It's Not Butter, where it was just the hands, the man's hands and the woman's hands, and there were a series of commercials, and they never really said, oh, buy this margarine. It was mainly just them talking and using the margarine as part of their activities, and there was no conclusion. Okay. Also, whether to put the strongest arguments first or last. We talk about, in marketing, we talk about something called primacy and recency. And this is something to bear in mind as you go on interviews as well. Primacy is what comes first, and recency is what comes last. And it's a function of the way our brains are constructed that we tend to remember things that come first and last, and everything in the middle just kind of gets squished together. That we have no clear memory. So as you go to interview, you should think about being the first or last interview of the day, or the first or last interview before lunch, before and after lunch. Because if you are in the middle somewhere, it's entirely likely that the interviewer will confuse attributes between the candidates that all just kind of got mushed together. And the same thing happens when we talk about a commercial or any other form of marketing communication, is that there's a tendency to squish together the middle of the commercial, even in a short 30-second commercial. So the notion is, tell what you're going to tell, then tell it, and then tell people what you told, so that you've got both the primacy and the recency covered. You'll notice that, for instance, in prescription drug advertising, which is a good example of this, is that they squish together all the side effects, the negative side effects that they're required by law to include in their advertising. They squish them together in the middle of the commercial really fast, knowing that that's the part that you're going to be most likely to discount or overlook. Okay. And then in terms of the structure, whether it's a one-sided or it's a two-sided. So for instance, talking about your brand versus comparing your brand to a competitor's brand. Okay. And finally, within structure, we have to think about the format of the communication. Things like the colors that are used. Brands are very protective of their colors. So you'll notice, I'm sure at least a few of you go to Starbucks, that green is on their cups, it's on their aprons, it's in all their advertising, it's on signage in the store, it's everywhere, that particular shade of green. John Deere, which manufactures tractors and farm implements and things like that, has actually patented the shade of green that they use. It's called John Deere Green, and it's patented, and no one else can use that particular shade of green. When I work with clients, one of the first things I do is I ask them to give me their color palette, which are normally, because I do digital, they're normally hexadecimal codes. Every color that is imaginable can be represented by some combination of 6 alphanumeric characters, so letters or numbers. And if you're ever interested, you can just Google hex codes and you will see all the different codes out there. So for instance, and they all start with a pound. So pound FFFFF, 6 Fs, is white. And pound 0060s is black. Okay. And so those are pure white and pure black, and then of course you have every combination under the rainbow. Headline. In print copy, which includes digital, the headline gets something like 50–60% more attention than the rest of the copy. So obviously the headline requires special attention. Then of course you have the rest of the copy, and then you have images that are used. And images can be across various, images and copy both, you see across every form of communication. Okay? So, next we need to choose our channels. Okay. Like I said, until we master the Vulcan mind meld, we'll have to use some medium to carry the message. We have a choice, a general choice, between two different types of medium. One are personal communications, and the other are impersonal communications. Advertising, for instance, is an example of impersonal. Everybody gets exactly the same message, regardless of whether it really applies to you or not. Direct marketing, digital, and personal selling all are personal forms of communication. Direct marketing less so because it may be relatively little that changes in the message from one person to the next. Usually the major change is adding some personalization by adding your name and address and things like that. Maybe they know something else about you, like that you have a child or you own a particular model and year of car, or something like that that they've acquired from some database someplace. But commonly, digital is much more, digital and personal are much more customized forms of personal communication. Okay. Some of the things to consider in designing your message, one is the source. The source is who's going to tell the story. And there are lots of options. A common option is to use a celebrity, whether it's a sports figure, someone from entertainment. We saw the danger of using celebrities as your spokespeople, the source of your advertising. And that is that the bad actions of those celebrities reflect poorly on the brand itself. Google is right now under a lot of pressure from advertisers. We already talked about PewDiePie, right? Where the ad networks meant that a number of advertisers' ads showed up on PewDiePie, and then PewDiePie said something, I forget, was it racial? Something very racially, well, that's race. So, yeah, so something very racially insensitive, and so advertisers no longer wanted to be associated with PewDiePie. You saw the same thing with Tiger Woods, for instance, when his affairs came to light, that advertisers dropped him like a hot potato. But the problem is that you have spent a lot of money cementing the celebrity and the brand together in consumers' minds. So when they do some bad act, you can't completely divorce those attitudes that you have cemented together. One solution that companies are using sometimes is something that's called dead celebrities. So somebody like Fred Astaire or something, somebody who's been dead for a long time, And there's no dirt ever going to come out about a dead celebrity, because if it were going to come out, it would have come out by now. And he can't do anything else because he's dead. So that's a solution that some businesses choose, is to use the dead celebrity as their spokesperson. Another option is to use employees. Yeah.
For dead celebrities, do they have to get rights to that, or can they use any dead person?
They do. The image of that person, I believe, is always theirs. The words of that person are theirs for their death plus 50 years. So, for instance, when they built the MLK Memorial over in the Tidal Basin, they had to pay the family to include words from his speeches on that memorial. So, like with Fred Astaire, where they're actually using old video, from old movies, they actually have to pay the studio, because the studio owns the copyrights on that. So yeah, but still a lot cheaper than using a live celebrity who may get millions of dollars for something like that. You can also use employees of the organization, and in digital this is increasingly common, to use the celebrities to create content. So, for instance, you may have the CEO who has a blog and who has social media. You see that with some of the TV stations in here, where Topper Shutt, who's the weatherman for Channel... Anyway, he promotes, connect with me on Facebook so that you can get my forecasts on an hour-by-hour basis or whatever. Okay, so increasingly we see employees of an organization being important sources. It can be, an average Joe. Usually I'm more attractive than average Joe, but, just an average person that you don't know and don't recognize who's used in the commercials. There have been some problems with that as well, with people who became fairly famous for the commercial that they made, and then when they went on to represent another company, it muddled the message somewhat. So there used to be, you guys may remember this from when you were little, there used to be this old grandmotherly type person who worked for Wendy's, and her tagline was, "Where's the beef?" Comparing Wendy's with the bigger patty to other competitors who had a smaller patty. It was very problematic when she started working for one of the competitors, also making messages for them. And you can't stop them from doing that. In most cases, those don't hold up in court. So it can be problematic picking a regular Joe. The other you might see is professionals. So like a physician who's talking about a medical condition or a drug that's designed to treat that medical condition. Or you may see someone who is a financial planner talking about insurance and trusts and things like that. There's that commercial that they've been running recently where you have a bunch of TV doctors kind of spoofing the idea that they know anything about medicine, which I think is fairly effective. Okay. All right. Collecting feedback. It used to be that advertisers did a pretty piss-poor job of understanding whether their advertising worked or didn't work. Advertising agencies and in-house advertising departments will commonly bring in a focus group and ask them, do you remember seeing this ad? What did the ad talk about? They may do a pre-test, post-test, where they bring in people and ask them about the brand, and then after the commercial has been run a number of times, they'll bring in people and they will ask them again about their attitudes and try and measure the amount of change in attitudes that occurred between the pre-test and the post-test. That whole process is something we talk about, one of the things we talk about in market research, and it's fraught with a lot of problems. So companies have done a relatively poor job of tracking the performance of their advertising, and they're generally stopped with just asking about awareness and attitudes. They can't get any deeper into that because you cannot, you can, it just isn't effective, to ask consumers, have you bought this, or how many times have you bought this? Because even the most honest people just don't remember. They don't remember what they bought, and they certainly can't predict what they will buy in the future. They can, there's no reality behind it. So to try and actually track the return on investment from advertising has always been hugely problematic. One of the reasons that I think more and more companies are using digital advertising is because you can very, very precisely determine the return on investment for digital advertising because it occurs on a platform where every click is monitored. So for instance, on my website, I can tell you exactly how many people come to my website. I can tell you what pages they go to. I can tell you how many times they've been to those pages. I can tell you whether an ad that I placed on Facebook brought them to my page. I can tell you whether that person who came in from Facebook actually bought my products. I don't have products, but I mean if I did, for my clients, okay? So I can tell you everything about, except who that person is, unless I've used some kind of registration. So like on Amazon, where you log in most of the time. Amazon has personal identifiable information about you. But anybody that has a digital property can get anonymous information that tells them everything that is going on. So I can very accurately tell a client, this is the ROI of that particular Facebook ad that we ran because I know how much was purchased. Now it gets a little more complicated if you're a brick and click, meaning that you have both brick and mortar stores as well as online stores, because consumers may have chosen to go to your brick and mortar store, and I lose them when they get to your brick and mortar store. Many stores are trying to get beyond that by asking you for your email address every time you make a purchase. That allows them then to track you back to your digital footprint and know that you came to their store because of an email that you received from the company or from a particular Facebook ad that you saw. Okay. If a sale does not occur online, it becomes challenging to get the full ROI. In that case, what companies will often do is they will use kind of a lag model where they run ads and assume that an increase in sales shortly after the ad runs is explained by the ad itself. Really tough to do. When I worked in direct marketing, it was much easier because we would code everything. So for instance, if we had a TV ad running, we would display the phone number, and when people called in, they were told to ask for a particular extension. That extension didn't exist. That extension just told us which ad they were responding to. Same with print ads. We would add a little code onto the bottom of the information card that you sent in, for instance, and that told us exactly what magazine that ad appeared in, what magazine or newspaper, when it appeared. So if we had multiples running, I could tell you that this is the ad that we had running in March, and the other responses were from an ad we had running in April. Okay. So I can get much more specific information. Another way that we're able to track the performance of advertising is through monitoring conversations that occur in public spaces. Now, we never had access to people's living rooms or kitchen tables before, so we never knew what people were talking about. But of course, now we do know what people are talking about. We can hear them talk to each other on social media, and we know that a particular ad has resonated when we start to hear discussions related to pieces of that ad. Okay? Now, how are we on time? All right. So the next topic that I want to talk about is setting the budget for your campaign that you're running. Okay? I've worked with a lot of startup companies and even bigger companies sometimes that have problems. And I worked for the Small Business Administration for a while, and one of the, is there a question? Okay. One of the typical questions that I was asked is, how much do I spend on advertising? Which is a very valid question, right? And there are 4 strategies that the book talks about in terms of setting the advertising budget. One strategy is all I can afford. I'm going to allocate as much as I can to advertising, which unfortunately for startups often translates to I'm not going to spend anything on advertising. Okay? Now recall the statement that I made when I started today's class, which was, if you do not effectively communicate your value proposition, you have wasted everything else that you have done in building your product. Okay. So if you read some of the gurus that are out there writing about things like lean and agile and other tactics for building products, one of the things that they recommend is that you start marketing before you write the first line of code or put the first 2 lines together on your diagram for your product. The reason being that marketing is important. Okay. So granted, you're not going to start advertising right away, but you are going to start feeling out your target market to make sure that you're building in the features and benefits that they want, that you're solving a real problem that your target market has. If you're not doing that, then you've just wasted everything. Once you have a product, then you have to allocate enough money to communicate the features, benefits, and value proposition of that product to your target market. Okay? But consistently, I'll see, especially larger companies come in who do have some money, who allocate funds based on some, oh, last year we spent $1 million, so next year we're going to spend $1.2 million. All right. Okay. Another tactic that's used commonly is called the percentage of sales. With the percentage of sales method, what you're doing is allocating a piece of the selling price of every product towards advertising. So in effect, what you're doing is you're creating an extra variable cost. Right? So you add in 5 cents per unit, $1 per unit, whatever it is, on a per unit basis. Now, obviously, you can't set this money aside as you sell units. So the way this is commonly implemented is that you forecast how many units you will sell and allocate your 5 cents or $1 or whatever based on that forecast. So if we forecast that we're going to sell 100,000 units and we're going to set aside $1 per unit, then we're going to set aside $100,000 as our advertising budget for the year. Yes?
Does anybody do it as percent of previous sales?
I have not seen it, but these are not the only. These are just the 4 most common ways. Okay. The third way that's used is called comparative parity. What that means is I'm going to allocate my advertising budget so that I'm spending about what my competitors are spending. Now, for startups, this is an easy way of allocating advertising budget. You look at your competitors, and especially if they're publicly held corporations, it's relatively easy to find out how much they're spending on advertising. If not, there's probably an industry association that has information about average advertising spend. And in some cases, they will split that up by gross revenue. So businesses that make below this amount spend X amount on advertising and so forth. So that you can get kind of a baseline and you can benchmark yourself against them. Okay. The fourth method is the most complicated. And that's called the objective task method. So remember earlier we talked about what your objectives were. The objective task method looks to allocate advertising dollars based on how many dollars it will take to achieve those objectives. Now, obviously, this does not work for a new company because they don't have the information necessary. Even a lot of established companies may not have this kind of information available. When I worked for the direct marketing agency, what we did, is we had a bunch of clients, and we always did the objective task method with prospective clients. But we had a lot of data from our existing clients so that we could say, in this particular industry, our clients commonly see X% increase in awareness, let's say, for X number of dollars. So I would commonly put together budgets for prospective clients where I would identify our anticipated return on investment, whether that return was, say, 1%. Usually it was between 1 and 2% because that's what our clients typically got as a return And that's a really good return on investment for, not a return on investment, percent purchase. So for instance, if we were sending out 3,000 pieces of mail, we would expect that 30 of them would purchase. Okay. In other words, 1%. So we were able to put together, here's what your product sells for, this is how many sales we expect, so this is the revenue that you will get, and this is what it will cost us to generate that revenue for you. Okay. I have not seen a lot of organizations use an objective task method, although it is becoming more common now that with digital, you have more data. Okay. So companies are able to look at their past performance and make very reasonable predictions of how much their ROI will be on a particular campaign. All right, questions? All right, let's take a quick break. We'll come back and we will finish these two chapters. All right, so before the break, we had discussed the budget. The last thing I want to talk about I think it's the last thing, one of the last things, there's a few more things, about the promotional mix is I want to talk about the different elements of the promotional mix and the relative advantages and disadvantages of those elements of the promotional mix. All right, so advertising is actually a broad category because we have, as I mentioned, broadcast and cable TV. We have radio, which we really haven't talked about yet, print, online, and outdoor advertising. So TV advertising, it should come as no shock to you, is the most expensive form of impersonal advertising. But a lot of things have changed about that. For instance, on a lot of cable channels, you can get packages of TV ads that are relatively inexpensive. And while broadcast TV has low differentiation, a number of the cable channels do offer much more homogeneous markets. The classic advantage of advertising is the number of eyeballs, and that's exactly how we talk about this, is the number of eyeballs that you get from a TV viewing, especially when you talk about a special event like the Super Bowl. Of course, you're also talking about a huge cost for the Super Bowl. Last year, the commercials, I think, were about $4 million per 30 seconds of time on the Super Bowl. Now, for that, you buy a lot of eyeballs. But the most important thing about the Super Bowl is that it gets a lot of what we call secondary viewership, which means that people watch the commercials outside of the games, as well as watching the games outside of the actual play. It tends, regardless of which TV station you choose, it tends to be relatively unpersuasive. It's just the nature of TV advertising, and to a certain extent, advertising in general. Radio can be very fast, and that's one of the advantages for it. If you have some immediate need, you can call a radio station and send them over a copy that the DJs will read on the radio station. So you can get things up on radio very, very fast. Whereas a TV spot could take you months of pre-production, filming, and post-production to get a TV commercial on the air. Print is dying out, although some magazines are still fairly popular. For the most part, print is dying. Online is increasing, but online advertising, as opposed to other digital tools, is really not optimal for most businesses. You have mobile phones now that have apps that allow you to block ads. You have websites that are becoming more reluctant to have ads because Google is starting to penalize sites with too many ads so that it's harder for them to get found. We already mentioned outdoor is really declining significantly. Personal selling. One of the huge advantages for personal selling is that it's incredibly persuasive, probably the most persuasive form of advertising. But when you talk about outside salespeople specifically, it is the most expensive form of advertising. Or promotion. So primarily, personal selling is used for high-value goods like cars, and even that's not a traditional outside salesperson. Real estate uses an outside personal salesperson, and industrial sales use personal salespeople. Sales promotion varies dramatically. Usually there's somewhat of a lead time for doing sales promotion. But this is such a mixed bag of stuff that it's hard to make generalities about sales promotion. Public relations is, we'll talk about public relations more, but it's unpaid. So technically it's the cheapest, but as we'll see in a few minutes, there are some serious costs associated with public relations. And then direct digital, we know, is growing dramatically. The ROI for direct and digital is fairly high, and it's also traceable, which I think accounts for some of its popularity. Okay. We also try to balance the various elements in the IMC stable between push and pull marketing. Push marketing is when you try to promote products to the channel. So you're pushing products towards consumers. For instance, manufacturers often pay what are called slotting fees, which are fees paid to retailers for getting retail space on the store shelf space. Okay, so that's a form of push marketing. All right. Pull marketing, on the other hand, is designed to reach consumers with the notion that consumers will pull product off the shelves, and retailers and subsequently wholesalers will have to order more product to replace the product that consumers pulled off the shelves. Now, most products use a combination of these two strategies. Using a single strategy alone is probably not going to be particularly effective. Okay. Then the last thing in this chapter is they talk about some socially responsible advertising tactics. Some of these are illegal, some are just not very consumer oriented. So for instance, deceptive advertising is illegal. Deceptive advertising is telling bold-faced lies about your product. Puffery, on the other hand, is exaggerating about your product. And it's not illegal, but it can have very negative marketing consequences, especially if you've promised that your product can do something and then it does not perform well in that task. One of the things that I've seen, and people are starting to comment on it in digital, is that everybody is the best. Everybody. Everything, every product is the best. Best-selling, award-winning. Everybody. It's kind of like Lake Wobegon, where it's statistically impossible for all of the children to be above average. It's statistically impossible for everybody and everything in digital to be the best. So I think that's all going to come to a head pretty quickly here. Bait and switch is illegal. Bait and switch involves advertising a particular product to get consumers into the store, then switching them for a more expensive product when you get to the store. There's fine lines here, and again, I'm not an attorney, so I can't tell you. For instance, what car dealers will often do is advertise a particular car that is at a very cheap price, and that gets customers in the door. Of course, when the customer gets there, that particular vehicle is already sold. Because each vehicle is individually identifiable, they're able to get away with that because they have sold that one particular vehicle. It's harder for, say, an appliance retailer to get people in and say, you know, we've got this refrigerator that's super cheap, and they get there and it's not cheap. The notion is that, or the way the rules are constructed, is that a store should have enough supply on hand to satisfy normal demand or offer rain checks. Now, the exception is when you have these, Black Friday events and stuff like that, and I'm not sure what it is in the law that allows them to get past that, but those are an exception. Okay. On the positive side of socially responsible, you have things like a proactive social agenda, which is becoming increasingly common for organizations to have some kind of social agenda or to have some policy towards being socially responsible. So, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, someone used their Tesla to stop a vehicle that was out of control so that that person would not get any more seriously hurt. And what's his face from Tesla? What's the guy from Tesla? Elon Musk. Elon Musk heard the story and sent the guy a free replacement Tesla. Okay. So we're starting to see more and more of these pro-social activities on the part of organizations. And one of the classic examples that I use a lot is the Dove commercials with the Campaign for Real Women, designed to help women feel better about their physical appearance. Sales people who lie, out and out lie, is illegal. And one of the things that sales people have to worry about specifically is a 3-day cooling off period that is provided by law for consumers who buy products. It's normally designed for people who buy products in their home, but I've seen it extended to other kinds of products where, not like in a retail situation, but more in other kinds of situations. For instance, gyms that get people in for the free tour and then sell them a year membership or something like that. Often I see a 3-day cooling off period applied to that, and that is to allow the consumer 3 days to rescind the contract. Okay. It only happens in the case of contracts. So those are some of the aspects of social responsibility, and that finishes the discussion on integrated marketing communication. Any questions about Chapter 14? Okay, so we're going to move on to Chapter 15 then. All right. So 15 is on advertising and public relations. Some of this I've already talked about. There are various types of advertising. For instance, there's institutional advertising. So for instance, GE brings good things to life is an example of an institutional advertisement that's designed to promote GE as a company. Not its light bulbs, not its appliances, not any specific brand, but the company as a whole. The other kind of advertising is called product advertising, where the company is trying to promote a particular brand. Increasingly, we also have social advertising, where a company is advertising some kind of socially responsible action or is partnered with a nonprofit to promote their social agenda. And then, of course, PSAs, public service announcements. So the steps, exactly the same as what we talked about for IMC, but some of the intricacies within those steps are different. So for instance, when we talk about advertising, we have 3 basic parts of types of advertising, and these vary based primarily on where the product is in the product life cycle. So the first kind of advertising is called informative advertising, and this is designed to share the value of the product, enhance the company image, to talk about how something works, price changes, or available service. So that's informative. The second kind is called persuasive. Persuasive is designed to drive brand preference so that consumers choose the brand over other brands. This is what we see most, I think, when we talk about advertising. So encourage people to switch, change their perceptions about the brand, buy something that is new, different. All right? And then the final kind is reminder. And reminder advertising is designed to help maintain relationships between the customer and the brand or the company, remind them to buy the product. So for instance, they have a series of milk commercials that were running over the last few years. It's not like you don't know milk exists. It's a reminder, hey, go out and buy milk. Okay? Budget, again, is somewhat based on product life cycle, although there are other considerations. For instance, how much the competition is spending. If you have a major competitor who is outspending you 10 to 1 on advertising, it is really, really hard to sell your product, regardless of how good your product might be. And then increasingly we have metrics and KPIs, or key performance indicators, that are important for brands when they set their budgets. In terms of the ad strategy, we talk about the concept, which is kind of the big idea that you're hoping is going to help break through the clutter. And, I just pulled these stats from your book, and that was that the average commercial costs about $350,000 to create between pre-filming, post, right? And $122,000 each time it airs. But then, of course, that both of those numbers vary dramatically depending on the brand and how much they want to spend. There are celebrity endorsers who get millions of dollars a year for appearing in commercials for the brand. So obviously those cost a lot more than $350,000 to create. Increasingly with ad strategy, we're talking about what the book calls Madison and Vine, which you'll hear in other places as well. And it's this combination of advertising and entertainment. So we call advertainment is another way of looking at it. And those occur through things like ad placement in movies, TV shows. If you see the name of a brand in some kind of entertainment, it's entirely likely that the brand paid to be there. They are not there by accident. Okay, so that motorcycle that was used in the Spider-Man movie, afterwards the sales of that particular brand of motorcycle skyrocketed. The other kind of advertainment that we see is commercials that are worth watching, where like the margarine commercial, where there was like a storyline and the story would progress from a beginning to an end across multiple ads. Okay. We talk about the concept, or the big idea, the execution, and we've talked about some of these forms of execution already when we talked about the themes. Some of those themes are also execution, so like humorous and emotional. Some of the ones that we did not talk about as also being themes are slice of life. Slice of life is like the Gap commercials, where it doesn't really talk about Gap. Nike has a lot of the same ones. They don't really talk about the benefits of Gap or Nike. They just show people using their products in activities and situations that are appealing in and of themselves. So that's kind of slice of life. We have musical commercials where there's a jingle. It used to be that almost every commercial had a jingle. That's really dying out now. You have personality symbols like the gecko for Geico, and testimonials. Okay. We also talk about the tone of the commercial in terms of being upbeat versus serious. And then we've already talked about consumer-generated content. The next step in the process is to choose the media. And there are several factors to consider in choosing the media. One of these is the reach. Reach has to do with the cumulative number of people that see your advertisement. That's reach. Frequency is the number of times that they see that ad. The notion being that, I don't know where this data came from, but on average they say that a person needs to see an advertisement 5 to 7 times before it has any impact. Okay? So impact is the third thing that we talk about in terms of a decision variable in determining which advertising media you're going to use. And then finally, engagement. You know, how engaged are you with the ad? And this is part of the reason that advertising itself is less persuasive than, say, social media, is that you're really not engaged. You're really a passive onlooker. Okay? You have to choose among the major media types, and often you're using some combination of those types, and then the specific vehicles. Companies choose which vehicles, meaning, you know, what program, what channel, what day, what time, primarily based on these factors as well as the demographics and psychographics of the people who watch a particular program, and whether that's part of their target market or not. Commonly we talk about this as media buying, that process of choosing exactly which programs and which slots within that program where your ad will appear. And here we talk about cost per thousand. We talk about continuity or timing. So for instance, a continuous ad is something where over a relatively long period of time you run this ad at a consistent level. Flighting, which your book for some reason doesn't talk about, is a situation where sometimes you have the ad running and sometimes you don't. And that's called flighting. Pulsing, on the other hand, is when you have a large amount of advertising and then you don't advertise for a while, and then a large amount of advertising. So the difference between flighting and pulsing is the volume of the advertisement. Pulsing is much more of a saturation type situation. Okay. In social media, we can talk about real-time planning, in that you can respond immediately or to events or activities that are going on, or in response to something consumers have said. And so real-time advertising is becoming increasingly important when we talk about social media planning. Newscasting focuses on the message, or excuse me, narrowcasting. Sorry, got news on the brain. Narrowcasting is when you focus a message on a relatively small select market. It allows you to lower your cost and it targets more effectively. So for instance, I had a client who sold jet skis, and he narrowcasted his advertising because he wasn't a manufacturer, he was a retailer. So he only reached certain markets at certain times of the year, and he only chose certain cable channels where his demographic was likely to be hanging out. Okay. Mobile is one of those things that's becoming increasingly common as a form of narrowcasting, because you have the opportunity to send messages specifically to people who have used certain keywords, for instance, in a search, or even use certain keywords in a Gmail message or other messaging app that allows for tracking. interestingly, I had an attorney who posted a segment on my blog today where he was talking about how the new privacy laws that were to go in effect that would have kept your ISP from selling information about your particular viewing habits, not just search, which Google has, but websites that you visit. Those rules were to have gone into effect. Those were promulgated at the end of Obama's administration, and the Trump administration has canceled those rules, so they will not go into effect. So it's no real change, it's just a protection that we thought we were going to get is not going to appear. And that impacts both mobile as well as desktops. Okay. All right, in terms of measuring the effectiveness, we already talked a little bit about this in terms of top of the funnel, bottom of the funnel, pre-test and post-test. So I really want to focus this discussion on the specific measurements that you do in advertising that are different than those that you do in general across integrated marketing communication. And so one of those is something called gross rating points, or GRP, and that's a multiplication of your reach and frequency. Often when you go to advertise, the channel, the particular media outlet that you want to use, will have information to guide you in the gross rating points that advertisers commonly get across different programs that they offer. Okay. In digital, we talk about things like cost per click and and click-through rate. So cost per click, CPC, is how much each click costs you. So it is, you divide the amount that you spent by the number of clicks. And again, most media outlets can give you this information. They can give you both what they routinely deliver to clients, and as a measurement after the fact, they can tell you exactly how successful your ad was. Click-through rate, CTR, is an assessment of the number of different pages. So if 1,000 people saw a particular ad, say on Google, the number of people who clicked on that ad is the click-through rate. So it is related to cost per click, but it's independent of spending. Okay. So there's a little bit in there about, whether you use an agency or an in-house for advertising, and we'll talk about the international implications of this next time. I don't want to take time today to do that because we're running out of time. So we're going to move on to talking about public relations. And public relations is a way of building goodwill for the company and counteracting rumors and other negative stories that may be spread about the company. It also, public relations is holding events and things like that. So within public relations, you have various activities. You have press releases, which is commonly what we talk about, that and product publicity that we talk about when we talk about public relations. We're talking about sending out press releases, press kits, that include additional items. Most of the stuff you read in newspapers, magazines, and even a lot of what's on TV, like in news and the talk shows and the late night comedy shows, most of that is supplied by the organization itself. That is not investigative reporting, going out and finding information. And that's why I say it's no more objective than advertising. Now, the difference is that a media outlet like the newspaper, for instance, can decide whether to print that or not, unlike an ad that they will print unless it violates their policies in some way. It also is, they can modify it, unlike an ad that they have to print as is. A press release, they can pick and choose which pieces of it they want to include. And so this gives a press release a rather unique format where the most important stuff is early in the press release and less important stuff is further on, because in the old days when you put together a newspaper, you basically literally cut from the bottom. It doesn't happen as much anymore, but people still think that way when they're putting together a newspaper, even though they're not physically cutting. Okay. It also includes public affairs, so organizing tours of the facility, hosting dignitaries and people. Employee relations, which is an important part of public relations that your book doesn't talk about. Lobbying falls under public relations as well. Investor relations, so all of those glossy brochures and the end of the year reports that are required to be filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, all of those fall under the purview of public relations. And finally, development. So if the organization has the ability to take donations, for instance, George Washington both gets money from tuition and gets money through development from alumni and from other charitable organizations. Okay. So some of the changes that we see is that social is blurring what's advertising and what's public relations. So you're starting to see a lot of different tools being used, and it's not always clear whether those are being done, even within the organization, by the public relations people, the social media people, or the advertising people. It's kind of a mixed bag, and you often run into conflicting situations, both personally as well as situations where one group is saying one thing on a social network and a different group is saying something very different. That lack of coordination that occurs. Another thing is that you're seeing, multiple publics that are important for an organization, and those publics are not staying where they belong. So investors are not just getting the investor brochures and all the glossy, wonderful stuff, but they're seeing the negative comments on social media as well. So, for instance, after the whole United brouhaha on Monday, Tuesday, the stock opened much lower than it had closed on Monday. Okay, so people just don't stay where they belong. All right, any questions, comments, issues?
All right.